This is part 2 commentary on race in North America, origin and evolution of a worldview by Dr. Audrey Smedley, right? And in part 1, we talked about the structure of race in America. And so in part 2, we're going to be discussing race as a forced modern idea and how cultural identity was understood by people in the past. So let's go ahead and open up the book and see if we can get some understanding.
It is significant that many contemporary scholars have concluded that race is a relatively recent concept in human history. The cultural structuring of a racial worldview coincides with the colonial expansion of certain Western European nations during the past 5 centuries, their encountering of populations very different from themselves, and the creation of a unique form of slavery.
Understand that lumping people together in groups based on some shared physical features has only occurred within the last 500 years or so, right? And the colonizers created this idea and they forced people into this worldview, right? And it was for their own benefit of making it easier for them to systematically dominate the peoples around the world, right? And especially those people with rich brown skin who the colonizers named black. And so the racial worldview was created to be one of their worst enemies, which should be enough incentive on its own for them to stop participating in that way of viewing themselves and viewing other people. Because that worldview and that system is a game that's always set up for them to lose, each and every time.
During the age of exploration and European expansion, rising competitiveness among the European nations and consciousness of their power to dominate others affected the way Europeans perceived indigenous peoples. These elements were factored early into their methods of dealing with all aliens. Race as a mode of describing and categorizing human beings appeared in the languages of the Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, French, Germans, Dutch, and English as these groups established colonial empires in the New World and Asia and set about dealing with their heterogeneous populations.
The people who stuck those labels on other people such as black, Indian, yellow, Asian, right? These were the colonizers. The colonizers from the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, the French, the Germans, the Dutch, and the English, right? These were the people who invented these categories and then they forced people into them. But notice one thing, who did we not see named in this list, right? None of the people who were invented, right? They were not participants in the invention of their own identity, right? And so they became slaves to the destructive inventions of the colonizers.
The peoples of the conquered areas of the New World and the other colored peoples of what is now called the Third World did not participate in the invention of race or in the compilation of racial classifications imposed upon them and others. To the extent that these peoples utilize the idiom today and operate within its strictures, they have inherited and acquiesced in the system of racial divisions created for them by the dominant Europeans.
You see that? When the colonizers were plotting and scheming on the identity of the people that they had encountered, they didn't say, hey, we're creating these new categories of people, and we were wondering if you can give us your input on what you would like to be called, right? And who you want to be grouped and lumped in with. And then what happened after they created the race categories and imposed them on other people? The people began to believe themselves to be those race categories, and then they passed that belief off to their children. And now today people willingly acquiesce or agree or comply or simply say yes to the identity that was created for them by the colonizers, right? Can you see how powerful that is, right? Let's go ahead and get some more.
Race is about status and inequality of rank in a society where competition for wealth and power is played out at the individual level. Any social scientist objectively observing American culture for the first time would readily recognize patterns of behavior that reflect the important social dimensions of racial status in America. From Americans' behavior alone, the social scientists would conclude that different races rank unequally along several dimensions, and that there are specific mechanisms for maintaining separateness and inequality among them.
Race is about status and inequality, just like Dr. Audrey Smedley said. And that's why that's all anyone should ever expect to get out of continuing to see the world that way, right? The seed only bears the fruit after its own kind, right? People who want to stop being slaves to the system, they have to move away from that racial worldview of thinking.
A fact denied by none of the experts is that race in the American mind was and is tantamount to a statement about profound and unbridgeable differences. In whatever context race comes to play, it conveys the meaning of social distance that cannot be transcended. This sense of difference is conditioned into most individuals early in their lives and becomes bonded to emotions nurtured in childhood.
Race is conditioned at a very early age, right? As soon as people start teaching their children to be black, then afterwards, once that child learns the negative meanings behind the color black in American culture, then they start to make those connections, right? And then they start to think to themselves that there must be something wrong with them, right? And then they begin to take that position of being at the bottom of society and seeing the world through that lens, right? And in contrast, when the parents teach the children that they're white, and then those children find out what white is and what white symbolizes, all the things positive in American culture, then they assume that they must somehow be better than other people, and especially those who are called black. And then they have two very different seeds planted in their minds, right, at a very young age, and which eventually blossom into their minds as they begin to age.
In the United States, it is expressed in all kinds of situations and encounters between peoples. It is structured into the social system through residential separation, differential education, training, and income, and informal restrictions against socializing, intermarriage, and common membership in various organizations, including most visibly the church. It is reflected in virtually all media representations of American society and institutional aspects of culture such as music, the arts, scientific research and educational institutions, politics and political forums, businesses, the theater, television, the music and film industries, and recreational activities. Not only are there separate churches, social organizations, and residential areas for blacks and whites, but there are also separate magazines, journals, and newspapers. Music is defined as black or white, although most of it shares the same musical roots, even though some of America's most outstanding musicians perform in both black and white arenas. There is black literature, poetry, and art thought to be distinct from white versions of these cultural genres. There is black entertainment, presumed to be different from white entertainment, and even some of the literature on health is targeted at a separate black or white audience. The media constantly portray and support the racial divide. Advertisements and politicians design their communications for a specific racial constituency. This is true for blacks and whites and increasingly for Latinos, Hispanics, who are being racialized to some degree in the contemporary world.
The media is probably one of the biggest supporters of the institution of race. And why is that? Because they make a lot of money from it, right? There's a lot of money to be made when you have headlines written as white cop kills black man, right? Or white woman kicks black couple out of restaurant, or any of these foolish types of headlines, which many of the times have nothing at all to do with a racial issue, right? But the media exploits that narrative for their own gains, right? And when I'm talking about media, I'm talking about YouTube as well, right? People who are on YouTube doing the same thing. And so it's both the black and white groups that are involved, right? And even the Latinos too, right? And understand this clearly, that people from these groups make a lot of money from the business of race, right? And they will do it at the expense of other people, right? They have no problem with doing that, right? These are what you call agents and gatekeepers of the system, right? And they are the viewers who support it as well. And they are everywhere and all around.
The primary thesis of this book, and what the research has shown, is that race was from its inception a folk classification, a product of popular beliefs about human differences that evolved from the 16th century through the 19th centuries.
Right, these popular beliefs started in the 1500s with the travelers' tales that were created by Europeans who visited the other parts of the world.
As a worldview, it was a cosmological ordering system structured out of the political, economic, and social experiences of peoples who had emerged as expansionists, conquering, dominating nations on a worldwide quest for wealth and power.
Classifying people as black, Indian, and white was an ordering system created by the conquerors. And we have to understand that completely, right, in its entirety, right? And it was and still is a useful tool for them in their quest for wealth and power over other people. Right? And it's a great tool, right? For its intended purpose of dominating, right? So I'm not mad at them for creating it, But we are not in the business of being dominated by other people or dominating other people, right? So those colonizing ideas don't work for us.
By a full classification, I refer to the ideologies, distinctions, and selective perceptions that constitute a society's popular imagery and interpretations of the world. People in all societies comprehend the world through prisms that their cultures and experiences proffer to them. They impose meanings on new discoveries and experiences that emanate from their own cultural conditioning and interpret these realities in terms with which they are familiar.
Ooh, look at Dr. Smedley snapping right here, right? In all societies, people understand the world through their own experiences and their own cultural lens, right? That's why you have people with that old English Christian mindset looking at other people's religions, they'll say that's of the devil, right? That's because their cultural background teaches them to respond in that manner, right, to something that they don't understand, right? But the people practicing those religions, they don't interpret it that way because they understand what they're doing from their own cultural context, right? Which is a completely different perspective from the person calling them demonic. Right? We're talking about the basics here. Understand.
One of the first examples of this described in this book is the way that English fabricated an imagery of savagery from their experiences with the Irish and then imposed this image on Native Americans and later Africans.
This duel between the English and the Irish we discuss in more detail in the commentary on the book, The Invention of the White Race, right? But the English had a disdain for the Irish, right, who were the original savages, according to the English, right? And the English imposed those ideas on the Native Americans, right? And then on the Africans. And so once again, it's due to the English cultural background and experiences which influenced their interpretation of these people, which then became attached to them in this folk classification of race.
Race, then, originated not as a product of scientific investigation, but as a folk concept. It initially had no basis, no point of origin in science or naturalistic studies. The folk idea was subsequently embraced, beginning in the mid to late 18th century, by naturalists and other learned people and given credence and legitimacy as a supposed product of scientific investigation. The scientists themselves undertook efforts to document the existence of the differences that the European cultural worldview demanded and had already created. In their efforts to promote a valid basis for the idea of race, scientists not only reflected the biases, beliefs, and conditioning of their times, but, as in the cases of Louis Agassiz in the 19th century and Sir Cyril Burt in the 20th, they often expressed their own personal fears, prejudices, and aesthetic evaluations of peoples whom they saw as alien.
Now look at who was involved in the perpetuation of the folk idea of race. It was the supposed learned people of the day, right? Which included scientists like Samuel George Morton, who was mismeasuring the skulls of humans and then rigging the results to justify his idea of intelligence differences between different people, right? And so these are the people who seek to control, right? And they will use any and every method and tool that they can use to achieve their end goal of domination, right? And if they can get away with it, they'll use it, right? And that includes race, science, religion, right? Politics, media, right? Any of those tools and anything else that they can invent, they will do it in order to get to that end game of domination, right? And so let's go to page 25 and let's get some more.
From its first continuous application to human populations during the 18th century, race was a way of categorizing what were already conceived of as inherently unequal human populations. Indeed, had all human beings been considered at least potentially equal by European explorers and exploiters, there would have been no need for the concept of race at all. People could have continued to be identified in the ways that had been employed ever since the first distinct groups came into contact with one another. That by their own names for themselves, their ethnic names, by the categorizing terms such as people, group, society, and nation, or by labels taken from the geographic region or locales they inhabited.
Now, isn't that the truth, right? What need is there to transform people from the Igbo over to a black person, or the Aztecs into the Indians, or the English into whites, if it's not for the purpose of the colonizers needing to separate people and create these hierarchies of races from high to low, and then giving people those statuses, right? There's no other need to do that, right? People had perfectly good names, which they had given to themselves before they were transformed into an identity coming from the colonizer's imagination. Understand that. And so we don't accept any identity coming from the colonizers whose intentions were to dominate and to destroy, right? And so we create our own cultural identities, right? For ourselves. The Earpois, that's who we are, right? Just like other people did before they came into the hands of the conquerors, right? These are the basics. And so when I'm talking about us having our own cultural identity, I'm talking about our own diet, dress code, customs, values, beliefs, systems of knowledge, habits, expectations, and standards, all these things which set us apart from other people, and none of which is based on the skin color or any other physical feature whatsoever, right? And so let's see some differences between racial identity and cultural or ethnic identity. Here we go.
Separateness and inequality are central to the idea of race. When the racial worldview is operant, an individual's or group status can never alter, as both status and behavior are presumed to be biologically fixed. Steven Steinberg captured this reality clearly in his discussion of ethnic European immigrants and racial minorities. Immigrants, he observes, were disparaged from their cultural peculiarities, and the implied message was, "You will become like us, whether you want to or not." When it came to racial minorities, however, the unspoken dictum was, "No matter how much like us you are, you will remain apart." The ideology of exclusion and low status ranking for blacks in America precludes recognition of how culturally similar whites and blacks are. This is particularly true in the southern states, where, class differences aside, they have shared a common culture for centuries.
In the racial worldview, black people should always expect to be on the bottom, right? No questions asked about it, right? Because race assumes that a person's status and behavior is predetermined, right? And the color black is linked with a low status in American thought, and then willingly accepted today by people with brown skin, right? So that's the status that's going to follow them, no matter how culturally similar they might be to whites. There's always that X factor in the racial status, right? And that always maintains the hierarchy in status, which is why it was established by the colonizers, right? This is just another obvious reason for people to stop identifying as black and to adopt a more appropriate culture, right? Attitudes and values, and then see a new world come into existence right before their own eyes, right? But that can never happen in the racial worldview. That's where an ethnic or a cultural identity is more appropriate.
The ancients knew that differences of language and custom were far more significant than mere physical traits. They also knew, despite many statements that appear to us as racist, in some of the works of Tacitus and Herodotus, for example, that a German tribesman or any other barbarian on the outskirts of civilization could learn the language and culture of Romans and become a citizen. In other words, that the ethnicity of a person or group was not something inborn and irredeemable. It could be transformed.
You see that? The ancients knew that the way people acted and their cultural practices were way more important than the size of someone's lips or how wide or how narrow their nose was or the skin color that they had, right? This is easy for us to understand, right? So if the Romans didn't want any dealings with the barbarians could learn the language and the culture of the Romans and then become a citizen, right? And in a religious sense, if people got tired of becoming a Christian, right, they could become a Muslim, or in many cases, they could simply be forced to become one, right? And then vice versa, right? And so if that person wanted to become a Jew, they could do so, right? And if they became tired of being a Jew and they wanted to become a Buddhist or go to Hinduism or become an atheist or whatever it is that was fitting for their life, right? They can do that, right? They can move freely within a variety of ethnic groups and simply learn the ways of those groups and then become accepted as members no matter their physical features, right? That's a huge difference from the idea of race, which says that you're locked into a certain group whose behavior, intelligence, and status are predetermined, right? And permanent. Now, the question is, why in the world would I want to sign up for that, right? Especially knowing that it's just an idea, right? Think about that. And so this is the end of the part 2 commentary on the book here, Race in North America, Origin and Evolution of a Worldview. Stay tuned for part 3, where we're going to be going into the European exploration of the world and the system of capitalism and its influence on the domination of others, right? So I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael. and I'll see you on part 3.